So I don't know if I've ever, oh man, that's crooked. Welcome back, everybody. We got our foundation piers in last week, and this week we're going to focus on building the platform for the deck. I've got a whole bunch of wood and supplies. I have my supply list. Went to hardware store last night and got all the supplies I need. This is just stuff that I came up with in my head. I hope I have it all because, as you can see, the house is up there and it doesn't even have power yet. So I am just using all battery powered tools and basic tools for this project. This is just to show you that you can do anything. You don't need fancy drawings. You don't need fancy tools. I just want to inspire you to get out there and try something. That is actually my plans for the deck, for the platform of it. We're actually going to start off by building some beams that will support this. This deck is going to be 11.5 feet long and about 6 feet wide. I am going to take out some of the decking material later and lay it out. It's a small deck. I don't really want to cut or rip a board down. I don't really have the tools here to do that. I'll determine the width here in a little bit, but first I need to make a couple of beams that will support this 11.5 foot by 6 foot deck. And with that, I'm going to use 2 by 10 by 12s. I'm going to cut these down to 11.5 feet to get started. I've tried to design this deck where it'd have the least amount of waste as possible. So as we go through this, I'll be capturing how much waste we have. The first thing I want to do is get a nice straight edge on these boards. So I'm just going to rip off about 1 inch using my square and my circular saw. And after we get that square, we'll then go and cut them down to length. On the other end is my cut end, my fresh end that I just cut square. I've measured down 11 feet, 6 inches, and 1/8. I'm gonna leave 1/8 of an inch buffer here because when I go to put my platform on top of my deck, that'll give me a 1/16 of an inch on each end to allow for a little bit of spacing. I'm just giving myself a little bit of room for error here so that when I lay my platform out, I can get it perfect. From there, you just put your pencil in the mark that you made, slide your square up to that mark, make sure it's nice and tight, and draw your line. When we go to cut this, we'll use this square just like we did on the other side, and we'll line up our square to our saw blade so that we can get a nice straight cut all the way across. So I've already lined up my square. It's about 1 inch away from my line where my saw blade will go. I'll hold this square nice and tight as I cut so it doesn't move, and I'll just run my saw blade along that line to create a perfect cut. I'll repeat that for the other board that I have, and then we can screw these together to make our first beam. I did take these boards and check the crown. What you want to do is you want to look down the board. You want to see if it's got a bow long ways, one way or another. You want to put the bow towards the top so that when you load this deck with pressure, it'll flatten it out and it won't sag in the middle. This next step is not necessary, but I want to put a little decorative edge on these beams so that they're not just straight across or flat on the ends when we put them in. So what I've done here is I've decided to just go with a 45-degree angle. And what I've done, I don't know if you can see it here, I put a mark at 4 inches on my board here. And so that's 4 inches from the top. I've also marked my tops of each beam with a T so that I'm always referencing the same side from here on out. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take my T-square. I think a 45-degree angle is gonna look nice. So I'll just line my framing square up with my 4-inch mark on my board, and I'll scribe a line down, and that's the line we'll cut to put an angle on the end of this beam. So when I cut these edges to put a nice 45-degree angle on them, dress them up a little bit, I'm using my T-square as a straight edge, and I'm gonna run my saw right down the side so that I get a nice straight cut every time. I'll repeat this on all 4 edges of the board. One quick word of advice I'd like to give you while you're doing projects: don't rush it. You'll never remember that you finished a day or two early, but you'll always see the cut that you didn't make quite right or the board that's a little bit crooked. So my advice is, whenever you're doing something like this, just take the time to do it right. Don't rush it. As you can see here, I've got my 2 beams ready to go. I've got my decorative 45-degree angle on each end of the beam. Now I'm going to laminate these together to make a nice strong beam to carry the load of the deck that we'll build on top of this. Eventually, this beam is going to be placed right down there on top of those concrete piers and be anchored to the side of the hill. So we are using 2 by 10 by 12 foot, number 2 pressure treated pine, so it's good for earth contact. And the way I'm going to put this beam together is by screwing in some of these lag bolts every 18 or inches so down the beam. I am going to measure this out and lay it out. While these are just structural, I want them to all look nice and aligned as we go through this. I'm using 2 7/8 headlock screws for this. You might be asking why I didn't go with like a 3-inch screw or a, if we're using 2x10s, why I didn't go with a 4-inch screw. Dimensional lumber is typically about a 1/2 inch to an inch smaller in dimension than what the tag actually says. So as you can see, if I go 2 7/8 inch, it's going to get me a pretty good connection all the way down. And what I'll do is I'll put half of them on this side. I'll screw some other ones from this other side, and that should laminate the beam together pretty darn well. I wanted to show you this jig I made. It only took about 2 minutes to create. I took some scraps from the lumber we just cut, screwed them together to make a little L shape here. Marked a random line in the center, drilled a couple holes in it, 2 inches from the edge on each side, from the top and the bottom. Now when I go out to mark out my screw locations, I know that each screw is going to be 2 inches from the top and 2 inches from the bottom, and they're going to be perfectly straight all the way down. Little things like this don't take that much more time, but make a big difference in the end. As I start to screw this beam together, I've laid out everywhere that I want my screws to go. I've used my jig to make sure they're all nice and straight. I'm going to work from this side down to the other, from one side to the other, and these boards are not perfectly straight, so I'm going to have to wrestle with them a little bit, but I want to keep the top edge flat because that's where our platform's going to live. So I'll just start with a couple of screws on this side and then keep working my way down about every 36 inches. Then I'm going to flip this over and do every 36 inches on the opposite side in between those measurements so that I've got a nice beam that's sandwiched. So the beam's going together pretty good. I'm getting down here towards the end, and you can see that one of these boards has a slight warp to it. And if I look down, it's just a little bit proud of the other board. So I want these to be perfectly flush. So in order to help when I screw this in, I put a nail, or a screw I guess, I put a screw in the board that is proud. I can take my hammer and pry it until it's level when I'm driving in my screw and make sure that it's perfectly flat. That's just a way to really put some pressure on it to get it straight. All right, I got this side of the board done. I'm going to flip it over and repeat it. On the other side, I'll put screws in between my 36-inch marks on this side and sandwich this board together. It should go a little bit quicker because I took the time to get the top of the board straight first. Make sure the beam's aligned at the top. So I'll flip this over and repeat. All right, I got this side of the beam done. I did make an exception on the end. I only put one, but that one will fall in between the two that are on the other side to sandwich the end together really well. All of these fall in between the other ones that I did on the other side. So about every 18 inches, in the middle it's a little bit less, there's 2 structural screws, 2 7/8 inch long, making this beam nice and sturdy. The next thing we have to do is go install it. So here you can see how this is going to take place. This beam will carry the load of the deck platform that will be built on top of it. I want to make sure that it's centered in between these 2 posts and aligned as closely to that edge over there as I can, because that's where we'll build the stairway off of. Last week was really difficult getting these concrete piers dug down a little over 2 feet and poured. It's the first time I've ever done anything like this. I really wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but if you can look, we're pretty close to level, and I've got some outdoor shims that I'll use to raise up the right side of this to make it perfectly even before we screw it in place. So I've got the beam centered, and this is the high side of the beam. I'm going to put one 2.5 inch structural screw in through this bracket into our beam, and then I'll go to the other side, shim it up to get it level, and screw everything in place. As you can see, I've got everything screwed in. I'll eventually go back and lag bolt that in there. Everything is nice and shimmed to level. Again, this is my first time really doing a project like this. Everything looks nice and straight, and I couldn't be happier. So I've gone back and forth on what I should do next. And at first I thought that I would go ahead and cut out these 6x6 posts that will carry the beam in the front to make it level with that one that's closer to the upper part of the hill. But what I think I'm going to do is actually make another beam first so that I know exactly how thick it is, so that I can cut each post exactly to the length I need it. My first idea was to cut the post so that they would be even with the bottom of these beams and then put the beam on top. But since this lumber is not perfectly dimensional and every little piece is a little bit different, I think I should make the beam first and then calculate how high each 6x6 post needs to be. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just trying to inspire people to get out here and do things on their own. If you are an expert and you think that I should be doing this another way, leave the comments down below. I love the feedback. I love to learn new things, so I'd appreciate any comments or feedback that you have. All right, so what I've got here is I've got my post. I've made sure that it is straight up and down this way. And the idea is that I'm going to reference off of the beam over there, off the top of the beam. I'm going to get a perfectly level line to where I need this beam to be. I'm going to mark exactly where the top of that needs to be level. I'm then going to measure my beam here and see what the thickness of that is and measure down the exact thickness of the beam minus about a 1/16 of an inch to account for this plate, and that's how high I'll cut my beam. Again, if you think there's a better way to do this, please let me know. You can see there was just about a 1 inch by 1 inch little chunk in the middle that didn't quite get cut by the circular saw. That's okay. I used a hand saw to finish sawing through it. And overall, for my first time ever doing this, I think it turned out pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do is make sure that my beams are level front and back, left to right. Make sure that they're nice and straight and that they're equidistant from here to that beam over there. And once I have both of these where I like them, I'm going to take some time to screw them in place and get them nice and solid before I put the supporting beam on top here. So I just threw the beam up here to check for level. Take some early measurements to see what it looks like, and overall looks really good that way. I also checked it in some places in the middle here, and as you can see, it's really level. It looks really nice. So basically what I did is I referenced everything off the top of my main beam over and then measured down. By measuring everything off a top reference gave me everything to make sure that it was level and square both ways versus trying to cut a post and shim it up to where I needed to go. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some diagonals from beam corner to beam corner and get this all squared up. And then we'll secure each beam to each post using 2 7/8 inch Simpson structural screws. So getting everything really square at this point is very important because this is the foundation that we're really building everything else off of. I measured my diagonals. It was 145 and 5/8 each diagonal. I put in a couple of screws into my first bracket here, one on the top and one on the side. Made sure that my post was nice and level and straight still. And then I checked for diagonal again just to make sure. Because when you start screwing things in, some things can start moving. Luckily enough, it all worked out for me. Everything stayed true and square. And so now I'm just going around and I'll put the rest of the screws in the brackets on the back. And once this is done, we can start building the platform on the top. So I don't know if you can tell by my chicken scratches here, but this deck is going to be 11.5 feet long and about 6 feet wide. The 6 feet wide, I'm not really sure exactly how wide I want this deck to be yet. I have these decking boards that I bought, and they're about 5.5 inches, but they're not perfect. But I don't want to have to rip one down. I do expect to leave about a 1 inch overhang all the way around, and I'm planning on doing a picture frame edge all the way around as well. But I don't want to have to rip one of these down or have some funny overhang that doesn't look right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all these boards out. I'm going to space them like I think they're going to be spaced on the deck, on the ground, and then take a measurement of that to see if I can work with 6 feet or does it need to be 5 feet, 11.5. I really don't know. So I just want to get a better measurement of what this should be once it's done. So you can see I'm just using my speed square to make sure everything's flush and level at the top of the joist because that's where the decking is going to go. That's where I want everything to be flat. And then I'm just tacking it in place with one 3-inch screw for now. Once I get all 4 corners done like this, it'll allow me to maneuver this by myself where I can get the overhangs all right, make sure that it's centered on our beams, make sure it's nice and square. So slight change of plans. The one screw method wasn't working out too well, so I went ahead and just lagged both sides of this together with 3 of these 6-inch structural screws just to hold it in place. This is really tough to do by myself, so I think if I lag it in place, I'll still be able to square it up at the end. Another thing I did is added a couple of boards here where I need to add my other rim joist. So I can just set my rim joist up there and on the other side to hold it in place while I screw it together. I've got 3 bolts in each corner, and I basically got the frame, outside frame of my deck platform built. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it, I'm going to shift it around so that it's centered on these beams. I'm going to measure it diagonally, square it up, and I'll toenail it right here into the joist to hold it all in place. So I'll just keep working at it until I get it right. All right, I've got this exactly where I want it. I'm at 155.5 on my diagonal both ways, right on the dot. I also checked for level across the corners just to make sure we're still on the same plane with everything. So to do that, I just take the level, stick it across the corner like that, and make sure that everything's level, which it is in this case in all 4 corners. So now I know I have a perfect base to work off of. So as I start putting my joist in the middle, if I line them up with the top of this board, everything should stay nice and flat on top. The next thing I'm going to do is just cut some 4x4s in half. These will eventually become the handrails for the deck. And the way I've designed this, I probably over-engineered it to have too many joists and things like that. But I want these handrails to be very sturdy. I want the deck to be very sturdy. Plan on using it for a long time. So I want to get the post in place first, and then I'm going to sandwich them in between another joist. One other note, I am going to leave these long, and since I don't have to be perfect and I want to save some batteries on my hand tools, I'm just going to saw these by hand. All right, so I'll try to explain what I've done here with my 4x4 posts. Those will eventually be the handrail that'll lead up to the stairs and also the railing to keep people from falling off the side of the deck. I wanted these to be rock solid, so I went ahead and just added another joist. This serves 2 purposes, so when I do my picture frame edge, I'll have a place to screw that picture frame edge into, along with my deck boards that'll go across. The other thing it does is it allows me to put structural screws 6 inches all the way through my beam this way, all the way through my post this way, and even one down here. And these are just for the blocking that's up here on the top, so that when I screw my 6-inch screw this way, it doesn't go all the way through the post. This post is rock solid. It's not going anywhere. It will take the whole deck down with it. All right, I wanted to show you where I'm headed with this whole deck deal. I wanted it to look symmetrical, and I wanted to give these posts a lot of support. So as you can see, what I'm doing here is everywhere I have a post, I'm doubling up on my joist. I'll later come back and fill in joists that run across here. Those I'll put up with joist hangers. The joists that I'm holding the post up with here are actually structural screws, 6-inch structural screws. I've got that will go into blocking, all the way through blocking that will be on the back of that post. So eventually these posts will be rock solid. They're not going anywhere. So one thing to note is I put each joist in. I am checking to make sure that they're straight up and that they're nice and square, just to keep everything in line. And the other thing I do is if I ever have a joist that's a little low or a little high, I want to make sure they're all flush. So I just drill a screw into one board, press on it with my hammer until it's level, and then drive in my anchor bolt to get it flush. One last triple check that I'm doing just to make sure that everything is perfectly aligned and square. As I'm putting these joists in, I actually take the diagonals to make sure that everything is staying square that way as well too. All right, so I've got my post in. I still need to add some blocking on the back of each post. I'll do the blocking all at the same time so I can just cut it all at once. And then I'll put an extra structural screw all the way through to the blocking to make these posts extra strong. They're not going anywhere. I want to make sure they're going to be that way for a long time. I do have some extra joists that I'm putting in between, and with these, instead of using structural screws, the 6-inch screws, those are a little bit expensive, I decided to go ahead and use joist hangers for a 2x10. Again, before I put everything in, I'm making sure it's nice and square in every direction. And instead of nails, I decided to go with structural screws because I am down here by the lake. I don't have a generator, I don't have a compressor. So since I'm doing everything with battery powered tools, the screws just made more sense. So I'm using the Simpson screws and the Simpson joist hangers, and I'm gonna fill those in any gaps we have. So here's a little trick. I need some blocking for the edge of my deck where the picture frame border is gonna go with the decking. I'm cutting off the end of each of these 2x10s just so I have a nice straight edge to work with for my joist. And instead of just cutting a random length, I'm actually cutting the space that I need my blocking, which is 3 7/8, so that I at least get a piece of blocking which doesn't have to be exactly perfect. I'm getting a nice straight edge on my joist and I'm wasting less material. The next thing I'm going to do is pull a string line across the center of my deck so that I can install blocking. I just bought this chalk line, and fair warning, when you're filling this up, you may want to wear a mask or gloves. It does contain a chemical that causes cancer in California. So I'm going to run some blocking down the center of my deck, and I'm going to offset it just to make it a little bit easier since I don't have a nailer. And so in order to get the center line of where I want to lay this blocking, I'm going to run a chalk line down the middle. I'm working alone today. I don't have an extra set of hands, so to keep that chalk line in place down there, I just put a screw right on my center line and loop the little metal hook of the chalk line to it. I'll pull it across, snap my line, and then I can start cutting my blocking. So to cut my blocking, I've got my spare piece of 2x10 here that I'll be using. Just gonna measure across the area, 5 1/16. Measure it out on my board. Make sure it's nice and square, and use my circular saw and my straight edge to get a nice straight cut as I cut through. Just like everything else on the deck, we're making sure that everything is nice and smooth across the top and that everything is nice and square. It just takes a little extra time to make sure that it's all perfect, but it makes a big difference in the end. I got all my blocking done. I'm not gonna lie, that was a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to measure each one of these individually and make sure it's perfect down to the 1/16 of an inch. Make sure that it's all level, square, and plumb, but it's worth the extra time. So with that, I'm gonna start decking now that I've got my blocking in place. I am going to put a picture frame edge on here, so I put some extra blocking on the ends here that you can see to support that picture frame edge. And I got to tell you, I'm pretty happy with the results of this. This thing is flat all the way across.